The engine of the battered SUV ticked as it cooled, a metallic metronome counting down the seconds in a world that had otherwise stopped moving. Marlowe killed the ignition and sat for a moment listening. Silence in the wilderness is rarely empty. Usually, it is a tapestry of wind, insects, and distant avian calls. But this silence was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the roof of the car. The spruce trees stood like iron spikes against a sky the color of wet slate. Nothing moved in the underbrush. The forest was holding its breath, or perhaps it was playing dead. Marlowe stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the roadside gravel. He adjusted the collar of his canvas jacket against the damp chill. 100 yards ahead, a line of yellow tape fluttered listlessly between two pines. Beside it stood Sheriff Harlan. The lawman looked older than the last time they had met. His waistline had thickened, and his graying hair was thinning in the wind. He held a cigarette with trembling fingers, the ash growing long and precarious before tumbling onto his uniform trousers. He didn't brush it off. He wasn't looking at the body on the ground. He was staring into the tree line, his eyes watery and wide. "You made good time," Harlan said, his voice rough with smoke and nerves. He finally looked at Marlowe, a desperate hope flickering in his gaze. "Tell me it's a bear, Marlowe. A rogue grizzly." "I can handle a bear." Marlowe ducked under the tape without answering. He approached the mound of earth where the local ranger lay. It wasn't a bear. The body had not been consumed. Predators eat. Monsters destroy. The ranger's chest had been collapsed inward, the ribcage shattered with the force of a hydraulic press. It looked as though a battering ram had struck him center mass. Marlowe knelt, his knees finding the cold mud. The air here was thick with scents. He smelled the metallic tang of copper from the blood pooling in the soil, the damp rot of decaying leaves, and something else, something muskier, sharper. It smelled like wet dog, but amplified 100 times, mixed with the rancid odor of spoiled meat. "Flashlight," Marlowe requested, extending a hand. Harlan passed it over. Marlowe shone the beam on the mud surrounding the corpse. The ground was churned up, but one print stood out. Preserved in the clay, it was massive, easily twice the width of Marlowe's own hand. 5 toes, deeply gouged claw marks at the tip of each digit. He hovered his hand over it for scale. "Wolf?" Harlan asked weakly. "No," Marlowe said, standing up. "Wolves run on their toes. This thing walks on its heels. It's plantigrade, bipedal." He moved to the nearest pine tree, a towering giant with bark like armor plate. About 9 feet up the trunk, the wood was stripped away in savage gashes. Blood had sprayed there, high above their heads. Marlowe ran his finger near the gouges. The creature had either thrown the ranger with impossible strength or struck him from above. But it was the marks themselves that chilled him. They weren't the chaotic thrashing of an animal sharpening its claws. They were rhythmic. 3 deep lines, a space, 3 deep lines. It was a territorial marker, a warning sign. Marlowe pulled a pair of tweezers and a small evidence bag from his pocket. Caught in a splinter of bark was a tuft of hair. It was coarse, stiff as wire, and the color of polished steel. He sealed it in the bag. Behind him, Harlan made a choking sound and looked away, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Time of death?" Harlan asked. Marlowe touched the edge of the track. The mud had crusted over, but the center was still tacky. About 6 hours ago. Dawn. They are active in the twilight hours, transitioning from night to day. They? The sheriff's voice cracked. Marlowe wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "It's not a bear, Harlan. You know that?" The sheriff nodded slowly, flicking his cigarette butt into a puddle where it hissed and died. I had to hope. He walked back to his patrol unit, reaching for the radio microphone. Marlowe followed, listening as the sheriff tried to raise the state dispatch. The radio spat static, a white noise that sounded like grinding stones. Finally, a bored voice from the Capitol broke through. "Sheriff, we have 0 resources to allocate for animal control. Issue a warning to hikers. Do not incite panic. Over. It's a homicide scene," Harlan shouted, but the line just clicked and buzzed with interference. Bureaucratic indifference hung in the air, colder than the mountain wind. Marlowe turned his back on the car, facing the north. The wind shifted, blowing down from the high ridges. It carried that faint, rancid scent again. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, a primal alarm system honed by 2 decades of tracking things that did not want to be found. He felt eyes on him. Not animal eyes which watch for movement, but intelligent eyes, calculating risk and intent. "Let's go," Marlowe said, his voice low. "We need to get out of the open. We're being watched." The ravine was a scar in the earth, a deep gash filled with shadows and ancient ferns that grew waist-high. Marlowe moved through the greenery with a rolling gait, placing his weight on the outside of his boots to suppress the snap of dry twigs. He was miles from town now, deep in the green zone where the map showed nothing but contour lines. He had smeared a paste of ash and mud over his face and neck to mask the scent of soap and detergent, breaking up the familiar outline of a human face. He found the trail a mile in. It wasn't a game trail. Deer weaved through the path of least resistance. This path had been forged by brute force. Saplings as thick as a wrist were snapped off, not near the ground, but at shoulder height. Whoever, whatever, had walked here didn't care about stealth. They walked with the arrogance of an apex predator that fears nothing in these woods. Marlowe followed the track down into the hollow. The air grew stagnant here, shielded from the wind. He found the bedding site in a dry creek bed. Large patches of grass were matted down into oval depressions. He counted 12 distinct spots, but there were likely more. Scattered around the perimeter were the cracked thigh bones of deer, marrow sucked clean. The smell was overpowering. The ground was saturated with urine, an acrid, ammonia-heavy stench that made his eyes water. It was a kennel smell, but multiplied by raw biological intensity. Something glinted in the mud near the largest nest. Marlowe crouched and picked it up. It was a plastic hair clip, bright pink, shaped like a butterfly, a child's trinket. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. These things hadn't just arrived. They had been scouting the perimeter of the town. They had been close enough to houses to find dropped toys. This wasn't just a migration. It was a reconnaissance mission. Snap. The sound came from behind him. It wasn't the settle of the earth or the wind. It was the deliberate fracture of wood under weight. Marlowe spun, bringing his carbine up in a fluid motion. The forest was still. The ferns hung motionless, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was pregnant with violence. From a thicket of rhododendrons to his left, a gray blur exploded outward. The speed was unnatural, defying the physics of something that size. Marlowe didn't have time to align the sights. He barely managed to twist his torso, swinging the heavy stock of the rifle to intercept the mass. The impact hit him like a linebacker. The air left his lungs in a painful whoosh, and he was thrown backward into the mud. The rifle flew from his grip, skittering across the stones. A shadow loomed over him. The creature was immense, a towering wall of wiry muscle and gray fur. Its muzzle was wrinkled back, revealing rows of yellowed, serrated teeth, thick saliva dripping onto Marlowe's chest. But it was the eyes that terrified him. Amber, with vertical slit pupils, they held no mindless animal rage. They held calculation, curiosity. Marlowe's hand found the hilt of his belt knife. He drove it upward, aiming for the junction of the neck and shoulder. The blade sank in, but it felt like stabbing a radial tire, thick, dense rubber and muscle. The creature roared, a sound like metal grinding on stone, and swiped. Claws sharp as scalpels tore through Marlowe's jacket and flayed the skin of his left shoulder. Pain, white-hot and searing, blinded him for a second. He kicked out, his boot connecting with the creature's knee, buying him a fraction of a second. His right hand scrambled at his hip, fingers closing around the grip of his sidearm. He drew and fired blindly into the creature's flank. Bang, bang. The shots were deafening in the ravine. The beast yelped a strangely high-pitched sound and leaped backward. It didn't fall. It simply vanished into the undergrowth with the same terrifying speed it had arrived with. Marlowe scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the wet stones, until his back hit a granite wall. He held the pistol with a shaking hand, sweeping the tree line. Blood was soaking his sleeve, warm and sticky. He pressed his hand to the wound, feeling the jagged ruin of his deltoid muscle. The woods around him came alive with rustling, not just one direction, all around. He had lost the element of surprise. He was injured, bleeding, and outnumbered. The pink beret burned in his pocket. They knew he was here. They had let the scout test him, and now the pack was closing in. Marlowe forced himself to stand, his vision graying at the edges. He had to move. If he stayed in the low ground, he was dead. The fire tower sat on the spine of the ridge like a rusted skeleton, its metal legs anchored into the granite. Marlowe dragged himself up the last flight of stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every rung of the ladder sent a jolt of agony through his left shoulder. He threw open the trap door, scrambled into the glass-walled cabin, and slammed the hatch shut, shoving a heavy steel chair over it. He was safe for the moment. The wind whistled through the gaps in the glass, a lonely, mournful tune. Marlowe swept the dusty table clear and laid out his first aid kit. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from shock and blood loss. He bit down on a leather strap from his gear bag and uncapped a bottle of rubbing alcohol. He poured it directly onto the shredded flesh of his shoulder. The pain was absolute. It whited out his vision, forcing a guttural groan through his clenched teeth. He leaned over the table, sweat dripping from his nose until the world stopped spinning. Thread. Needle. He cleaned the needle in the flame of a lighter. He had to close the wound. The scent of fresh blood would drive them into a frenzy. He pierced the skin. The sound of the needle popping through tough dermis was loud in the small room. 1 stitch. 2. He tied them off with slick, bloody fingers. 5 stitches in total. It was ugly work, a butcher's job, but it pulled the meat together. He taped a heavy gauze pad over it and injected a syringe of morphine into his thigh. Outside, the sun began to dip below the horizon. The mountains turned purple, then black. Marlowe picked up his thermal monocular. He moved to the window, scanning the valley floor below. The device hummed softly. The screen turned the world into shades of blue and gray. Then he saw them. White-hot signatures moved through the ravine he had just escaped. Not a pack. An army. He counted 20, 30, 40 heat signatures flowing like a liquid stream through the trees. They weren't running wild. They were moving in formation. Larger, brighter signatures flanked the main group, herding the smaller ones, keeping the perimeter tight. He shifted his gaze to a rocky outcrop overlooking the town lights in the distance. A single massive heat signature stood there, motionless. It was significantly larger than the others. The Alpha. It wasn't hunting. It was observing. It was studying the layout of the streets, the lights, the movement of the cars. Marlowe felt a grudging, terrified respect. This was a general surveying a battlefield. He pulled a topographical map from his vest and spread it on the table. He uncapped a pen with his teeth. He traced the ravine, the ridge, and the location of the Alpha. He drew a vector. The line pointed straight through the center of Iron Creek. The town sat in a geographical bottleneck. The mountains were too steep on either side. To migrate south, the pack had to go through the town, and they weren't going to sneak through. They were going to clear a path. Marlowe looked at the map. He had no radio, no cell service. He was the only one who knew the scale of what was coming. If he stayed in the tower, he might survive the night. But the town, families, children, the sheriff, would be a slaughterhouse by dawn. He checked his watch. 2 a.m. He had to go back down. The descent was torture. The morphine took the edge off, but his shoulder felt like it was packed with broken glass. He moved through the pre-dawn fog, a ghost in his own world. He reached the spot where he had left the SUV. The vehicle was untouched. The windows were intact. But as he walked around to the driver's side, he froze. Drawn in the mud around the car was a perfect circle. A claw had carved it deep into the dirt. They had found his car. They knew he was up there. They could have waited and killed him. But they hadn't. They let him go. Why? Marlowe opened the door and slid in. The answer hit him as he started the engine. They didn't want to just kill him. They wanted him to run. They wanted him to carry the fear back to the herd. Fear makes prey predictable. Fear makes prey run, and running triggers the chase. He slammed the car into gear. He would bring them their fear, but he would also bring them a war. The town hall was a cauldron of noise. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, stale coffee, and rising panic. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, faces tight. Harlan stood at the podium looking small and defeated, trying to talk over the shouting match between a local cattle rancher and the mayor. Marlowe shoved the double doors open. He didn't speak. He walked down the center aisle, his face pale beneath the grime, his left arm strapped tight to his chest in a sling. The room fell silent, row by row, like a wave crashing on shore. The sight of the tracker, usually a ghost, now bloodied and grim, commanded attention. "There are more than 50 of them," Marlowe said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the room. "They are moving in a column. They will be here by nightfall." "Wolves don't move in columns," a hunter in a camo hat scoffed, standing up. "You're spooked, Marlowe. You got scratched by a bear and now you're scaring the women folk." Marlowe didn't argue. He reached into his pocket and tossed the evidence bag onto the table in front of the mayor. The steel-gray, wire-thick hair sat there, alien and undeniable. He then tossed the pink butterfly clip next to it. "They were in the ravine," Marlowe said. "Scouting. They've been watching your backyards." A woman in the front row gasped, recognizing the clip. The skepticism in the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, vibrating terror. "We leave," Marlowe commanded. "Now, convoy, high beams, we stay together." The panic that followed was barely controlled. Within 30 minutes, a line of vehicles idled on Main Street. Pickups loaded with furniture, sedans packed with suitcases, a yellow school bus filled with the town's children. Harlan took the lead cruiser. Marlowe rode shotgun, his rifle resting on the dashboard. They rolled out of town as the rain began to fall, hard sheets of water that hammered the roofs. The convoy wound its way up the mountain road, the only paved exit from Iron Creek. The mood in the car was brittle. Harlan gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "We're going to make it," Harlan muttered, more to himself than Marlowe. They reached Devil's Turn, a narrow hook in the road bordered by a sheer cliff on one side and a drop-off on the other. Harlan slammed on the brakes. Blocking the road was a logging truck. It lay on its side, the trailer twisted, massive pine logs spilled across both lanes like spilled matchsticks. It wasn't an accident. The cab was empty. The logs were interlocked, forming a deliberate wall. "Reverse." Marlowe screamed, grabbing the radio handset. "All units, reverse, it's a trap." Horns blared. Confusion rippled down the line. The cars behind them were too close. They couldn't back up. The convoy compressed, trapped against the blockade. Then the rain seemed to solidify into shadows. From the cliffs above, dark shapes launched themselves into the air. They landed on the roofs of the cars with the sound of sledgehammers hitting sheet metal. Glass exploded. Screams tore through the drumming of the rain. A creature landed on the hood of the sheriff's cruiser. It was gaunt, wet fur plastered to a skeletal frame, but the muscles beneath coiled with power. It didn't attack the windshield. It jammed its claws into the seam of the driver's door. Metal groaned and shrieked as the door was peeled back, the hinges snapping like dried twigs. Harlan scrambled back, fumbling for his gun. Marlowe fired through the windshield. The glass spiderwebbed, turning opaque. The creature roared and leaped off, disappearing into the chaos. Down the line, it was a massacre of machinery. The creatures were slashing tires, biting through radiator grills. They weren't killing everyone yet. They were disabling the vehicles. They were sealing the exits. "Out!" Marlowe kicked his door open. "Abandon the cars! Back to town! Run!" He provided covering fire, the crack of his rifle answering the thunder overhead. People tumbled out of their warm cars into the freezing rain, clutching children, abandoning their lives packed in suitcases. "Don't look back!" Marlowe grabbed Harlan by the collar and dragged him out of the ruined cruiser. "Move!" The convoy became a stampede of foot traffic, fleeing back down the asphalt ribbon toward the town they had just tried to escape. Behind them the hounds howled, a sound of triumph. The trap had snapped shut. Iron Creek was no longer a home. It was a cage. The police station and the adjacent hardware store became the Alamo of Iron Creek. The illusion of safety was gone, washed away by the rain and the sight of twisted metal on the mountain road. The survivors were huddled in the station's lobby and the aisles of the store, shivering, wet, and stripped of hope. Marlowe took charge because no one else could. Harlan was catatonic, sitting on a bench, staring at his hands. Marlowe stood on a desk, his voice cutting through the sobbing. "Listen to me. We have stone walls here. We have light. We have weapons. If you want to live to see sunrise, you work. Now." He organized them ruthlessly. Able-bodied men were sent to the hardware store to strip the shelves. They returned with plywood, 2x4s, and boxes of 10-penny nails. The sound of hammers began to fill the air, a desperate rhythmic industrial noise. They boarded up the ground floor windows, layering the wood, driving long screws into the frames. Marlowe gathered the gun owners. It was a motley crew. Farmers with double-barreled shotguns, hunters with bolt-action deer rifles, a few handguns. "Ammo check," Marlowe ordered. It was bad. They had plenty of birdshot, which would just annoy the creatures. They had limited buckshot and fewer slugs. Marlowe drew a crude outline of a dogman on a whiteboard. He tapped the head with a piece of chalk. "Do not aim here. Their skulls are thick, sloped. Bullets will ricochet. Aim here." He circled the hips and the knees. "Shatter the bone structure. If it can't run, it can't fight. If it can't stand, we can finish it." In the back of the hardware store, a group was mixing chemicals. Marlowe had forbidden pipe bombs, too much risk of friendly fire, but he instructed them on making flame pots. Buckets filled with rags, motor oil, and paint thinner were placed at strategic choke points outside the doors. Trouble flared when Frank, the owner of the local lumber mill, pushed through the crowd. He was red-faced, flanked by 2 of his employees. "I'm taking my men and my guns to my house," Frank spat. "It's on the hill, high ground. I'm not dying in this rat trap with the rabble." "You walk out that door. You die alone," Marlowe said calmly. "And you take guns away from the group."
"Try and stop me."
Frank raised a shotgun. A click echoed in the room. Harlan had stood up. He held his service revolver steady, pointed at Frank's chest. The sheriff's eyes were clear again. "Sit down, Frank, or I swear to God I'll save the monsters the trouble." Frank hesitated, looked at the grim faces around him, and lowered his weapon. The unity held, barely. By twilight, the preparations were done. Marlowe strung a line of fishing wire around the perimeter of the street, attaching empty soup cans filled with pebbles. A primitive alarm system. The sun vanished behind the peaks. The town lights were still on, casting long, unnatural shadows. The fog began to roll down from the slopes, a white blanket that swallowed the world beyond 20 yards. Marlowe stood on the roof of the police station, watching the mist. The silence returned, deeper than before. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath before the pounce. The clock on the wall ticked past 10 p.m. The waiting was worse than the fighting. Every creak of the settling building sounded like a footstep. The sound was tiny, pathetic. A tin can rattling against the pavement. Inside the station, 50 heads snapped up. Breath hitched in throats. The fog outside was dense, swirling in the glow of the street lamps. Marlowe peered through a gap in the boarded window. Nothing. Just the white void. Then, movement. On the roof of the bakery across the street. A silhouette materialized from the fog. It sat on the parapet, casually, legs dangling over the edge like a gargoyle come to life. It was watching them. "It's just sitting there," whispered Kieran, the young deputy, his rifle shaking in his hands. "It's bait," Marlowe hissed.
"Don't." Crack.
Kieran fired. The glass of the bakery window shattered. The creature on the roof didn't fall. It simply leaned back and dissolved into the shadows. "You idiot." Marlowe grabbed Kieran's shoulder. "They were checking our range. You just told them exactly where we are and what we're shooting." As if on cue, the street erupted. 3 gray shapes burst from the alleyway. They didn't charge the doors. They attacked the barricades. With terrifying strength, they ripped at the plywood on the hardware store windows, tearing planks loose with the sound of screaming nails. "Fire!" Marlowe roared. The defenders opened up. Muzzle flashes lit the fog like strobe lights. The noise was deafening. Wood splintered. The creatures moved too fast, zigzagging, keeping low. One of them found a weak spot. It threw its shoulder into a boarded window of the hardware store. The wood snapped. The beast tumbled inside into the aisle of garden supplies. Screams erupted from the civilians huddled in the back. Marlowe didn't think. He vaulted the counter, sprinting into the store. He pumped his shotgun, loading a solid slug. He rounded the corner into the paint aisle. The beast was there, rising from a crouch, shaking glass from its fur. It snarled, lunging at a woman cowering on the floor. Marlowe whistled sharp and loud. The creature spun mid-motion, its amber eyes locking on him. Marlowe pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared. At 10 feet, the slug hit with the force of a cannonball. It struck the creature in the center of the chest, blowing it backward into a rack of paint cans. Cans exploded, showering the beast in white and blue latex. It thrashed, trying to rise, but its sternum was pulverized. Marlowe racked the slide and put a second round into its pelvis. It slumped, twitching. Outside, a whistle sounded, a strange, mimicking sound like a bird call but deeper. The attack stopped. The creatures outside retreated, dragging a wounded comrade into the mist. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Marlowe stood over the dead beast, breathing hard. The smell of gunpowder and copper blood filled the aisle. "Is it over?" Someone sobbed. Marlowe reloaded his weapon, his hands slick with sweat. "No," he said grimly. That was the stress test. They were probing for weak spots. He looked at the shattered window, and they found one. 3 a.m., the witching hour. The deepest part of the night when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb. The rain had stopped, leaving a dripping, heavy quiet. Marlowe paced the lobby. Something was wrong. The dogs in the residential houses, the ones left behind, had been barking earlier. Now they were silent. Then the lights died. The street lamps flickered and went black. The station plunged into darkness. Someone screamed.
"Emergency lights!"
Harlan shouted.
"Get the battery lanterns!"
Beams of light cut through the dusty air. "They cut the power," Marlowe said, realizing the intelligence required for such a move. "They know we rely on sight." A sound started above them, a rhythmic thumping. Not on the street, on the roof. It sounded like hail, but heavier. Thump, scrape, thump. "They're coming from above," Marlowe yelled. "Watch the skylights." Glass shattered overhead. Dark shapes poured through the ceiling vents, dropping into the lobby. Gunfire erupted, chaotic and blind. But it was a diversion. A massive crash shook the building. The back wall of the station, the old brick wall connecting to the alley, exploded inward. Dust and mortar sprayed across the room. Through the hole stepped the Alpha. It was a nightmare made flesh. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, its fur was matted with old scars. One ear was torn away. It didn't rush. It strode into the room, swatting aside a heavy oak desk as if it were cardboard.
"Flank it!"
Marlowe screamed, raising his shotgun. The Alpha moved with terrifying speed for its size. It crossed the room in 2 strides, backhanding Harlan into a wall. Marlowe fired, but the beast twisted, taking the shot in the shoulder meat. It didn't even slow down. It slammed into Marlowe. The shotgun flew from his hands. Marlowe hit the floor, feeling a rib crack with a sickening crunch. The air left him. He scrambled backward, sliding on the polished floor. The Alpha towered over him, drool dripping from its jaws. It raised a clawed hand to finish him. Marlowe's hand brushed against a canvas bag dropped by one of the deputies during the retreat. A fluorescent orange handle poked out, a flare gun. He didn't have time to aim. He grabbed the grip, pointed it upward, and pulled the trigger. The flare struck the Alpha directly in the open mouth. Phosphorus ignited with a blinding red glare. The beast reeled back, thrashing. A roar of muffled agony gurgling in its throat as the fire burned from the inside out. Smoke poured from its jaws. The sudden blinding light confused the pack. The sight of their invulnerable leader burning and stumbling in panic broke their coordination.
"Shoot it! Shoot the bastard!"
Marlowe yelled, coughing blood. Every gun in the room turned on the burning giant. A hail of lead hammered the Alpha. It stumbled, crashed into a support pillar, and finally fell, a smoking, twitching mound of fur and muscle. The pack, seeing the Alpha fall, hesitated. The tactical cohesion shattered. They were no longer an army. They were just animals, leaderless and afraid of the fire. They turned and fled, leaping back through the skylights and the broken wall, disappearing into the night. The sun rose gray and cold, filtering through the mist that clung to the ruins of Iron Creek. The silence had returned, but it was the silence of exhaustion, not anticipation. Marlowe sat on the steps of the police station. Dr. Sloan, the town medic, was finishing wrapping his ribs. Marlowe tried to light a cigarette, but his hands shook too much. Harlan, nursing a broken arm and a bruised face, reached over and lit it for him. "Thanks," Marlowe exhaled, the smoke mixing with the morning fog. The street was a graveyard of metal. Carcasses of the creatures lay scattered among the debris, black shapes on the wet asphalt. The sound of rotors cut the air. A black helicopter banked over the mountains, followed by two more. State markings. Then came the armored trucks. Men in unmarked tactical gear swarmed the town. They moved with efficient, practiced speed. They didn't offer blankets or coffee. They began bagging the bodies of the creatures, loading them into refrigerated trucks. A man in a suit approached the steps. He looked at Harlan, then at Marlowe. "Animal control issue," the suit said. "Rabid bear migration combined with a gas leak causing hallucinations. Mass hysteria." Harlan laughed, a bitter, dry sound. "Is that what you're calling it?" "That's what the report says, Sheriff," the suit said, his eyes dead and flat.
Sign here.
They cleaned it up. By noon, the bodies were gone. The blood was washed away. The survivors were being debriefed, intimidated, into silence. Marlowe threw his bag into the back of his SUV. The windshield was cracked, but it would hold. He wasn't staying for the thank yous. He wasn't staying for the cover-up. "You leaving?" Harlan asked, standing by the driver's window. "Job's done," Marlowe said. "I tracked them. We stopped them. Where will you go?" Marlowe nodded north. "They didn't all die, Harlan. The Alpha is dead. But the pack just split up. They're still moving." He put the car in gear and drove out of town. The bulldozers had already cleared the logging truck from Devil's Turn. The road was open. As he passed the sign that read "Leaving Iron Creek," Marlowe slowed. Hanging from the metal post, swaying gently in the wind, was a red dog collar with a brass tag. A trophy left by the retreating pack. A reminder. Marlowe touched the fresh bandage on his shoulder. He looked in the rearview mirror, watching the town disappear into the mist. He reached for the radio dial. Static hissed. Then a weather report cut through. Heavy storms moving into the northern counties tonight. Residents are advised to stay indoors. Marlowe pressed the accelerator. He was going north. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun.